The winter of 1911 did not bring many blizzards or fierce winds, and the vast majority of nights were astoundingly quiet. The acetylene lights in the house would be turned off at 11 p.m. Private candles would sometimes remain lit until midnight, when all of the men ought to be sound asleep. Bowers was singled out by many as the loudest snorer. A single crew member would always act as a night watchman to stay awake through the night and make sure everything stayed in order. They would often rather busy themselves with additional duties come morning rather than sleep. At 7 a.m., Clissold, the cook of the hut, would wake up and start preparing breakfast, and in turn wake the others with the smell of freshly prepared porridge and fried seal liver. As a strict rule, everyone had to be awake and ready to eat breakfast before 9 a.m. to ensure that everyone could contribute a full day's work. Every morning, Dr. Simpson would sleepily stumble out of the hut to check on his weather station. He also began experimenting with small weather balloons inflated with hydrogen that would ascend up into the air, carrying a compact array of data recording instruments. Lieutenant Evans and Wright would bring their telescopes outside to observe the state of the universe. Men would wash themselves by rubbing snow all over their bodies and pretending they enjoyed it. More intense, thorough sessions of bathing were strictly reserved for the weekends. The still air would carry the sounds of men skiing, dogs or ponies running, and ice cracking for miles upon miles. And on especially cold days, one could hear the particles of their smoky breath freeze and crackle mid-air. The dogs would be taken out for exercise, though naturally, outside conditions were sometimes perilous given the sunless days. During middays of April and early May, the sun would come close enough to the horizon to offer illumination reminiscent of an hour or two before sunrise. Otherwise, their only other light source was the shine of the full moon. At the start of winter, when there was still some light at midday, the crew would go outside to play football, a nominal outdoor exercise. Their skills improved with every match they played. The captain singled out Seaman Frederick Hooper, Petty Officer Evans, and Seaman Tom Crean as some of their best players. Gran was said to have also been good, had he not been so lazy. As a general rule, if they were to ski, the men were to ski alone, for it was the only chance they could take to spend any time in solitude. Following the tradition first started with the Discovery Expedition, Captain Scott relaunched the publication of the South Polar Times magazine, assigning its editorship to the capable hands of the young Cherry Garrard. A contribution box was designated for any members of the team to anonymously submit their prose, poetry, scientific accounts, and drawings. During this dark period, Ponting experimented with flash photography, with Scott noting the great power of the magnesium flashlight illuminating the landscape at long distances, theorizing that it could be used as a communicative tool as well. Wilson was known to spend 2 or 3 hours per day depicting scenes from his observations through expressive canvases of watercolor. Ever the perfectionist, if he noticed any mistakes or unsatisfactory renderings, he would tear the pictures up and start over. Captain Scott on occasion had even measured the details and dimensions of the landscapes Wilson painted and found them to be remarkably accurate. Apart from his musings in the arts, he was known by the men as undoubtedly the most knowledgeable, sincere, and selfless member of the group. Scott further wrote in his diary, "Words must always fail me when I talk of Bill Wilson. I believe he really is the finest character I ever met. The closer one gets to him, the more there is to admire. Every quality is so solid and dependable. Whatever the matter, one knows Bill will be sound, shrewdly practical, intensely loyal, and quite unselfish. Add to this a wider knowledge of persons and things than is at first guessable, a quiet vein of honor, and really consummate tact, and you have some idea of his values. I think he is the most popular member of the party, and that is saying much." Bertie Bowers was in charge of food management and stores in the hut, and distributions on the sledges. As Cherry Garrard held the bunk bed under him, He observed that every night, Bowers would stand on a chair and use his bunk as a desk, quietly writing down lists of remaining stores and weights. Birdie viewed difficulties as obstacles that were to be overcome and was never seen idle, always busying himself with odd chores or necessities that could be addressed. He would do his bidding to the best of his abilities, making sure that his comrades would feel comfortable. And throughout his entire stay on the mission, not once did he say a word to prompt recognition of his work, nor utter a moan of complaint. Bowers, together with Wilson, would team up near every day to record the measurements of all the numerous thermometers placed atop various positions in their surroundings. Such kind words were altogether absent from Captain Scott's diaries when referring to his second-in-command, Lieutenant Evans. In fact, very little is written of him or his character in Scott's journals, with more detailed and honest conversation reserved to letters he had written for his wife, Kathleen. Evans himself is a queer study. His boyish enthusiasm rallies all along till one sees clearly the childish limitations of its foundation and appreciate that it is not a rock to be built upon. Being desirous to help everyone, he is manfully incapable of doing it. There are problems ahead here, for I cannot consider him fitted for a superior position, though he is physically strong and fit for a subordinate. He seems incapable of expanding beyond the limits of an astonishingly narrow experience. It seemed that most of the men held the same sentiment, at least privately, with Debenham writing, "Teddy Evans, second-in-command, is a very nice, jolly fellow with overflowing spirits, out of sight of Scott. But he is not, unfortunately, the right man in the right place, and relations between him and the captain are rather strained, the fault, I think, being 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. He is great fun in company, but I don't like being alone with him. His confidences are too overwhelming and ill-advised." During lunches, group conversations could get heated as the eclectic mix of explorers discussed their theories and opinions across a never-ending supply of topics, such as whether tea or cocoa contained more merits. A gramophone they had brought with them filled the hut with a warm ambience in the aftermath of dinner time, playing through a selection of contemporary and classical records. On other occasions, someone would drive the pedals for the expedition's pianola or self-playing piano. For relaxation and mental stimulation, the men had with them a wealth of donated books to flip through, and no one flipped through as many and as effortlessly as Captain Scott himself. Cherry Garrard later wrote that Scott proved himself time and time again how easily he could forge friendships. He always gave great consideration and thought to any queries or suggestions that he was offered. It pleased everyone to see that Scott was a firm believer of science and would fondly discuss geological, meteorological, or other scientific subjects with the team's specialists. Even though he was not considered a particularly strong man, he sledged harder than anyone else, inspiring his crew to muster all their might. When he was not the center of attention, he was observed to be quite shy and reserved, and exceptionally emotional, almost to a feminine degree. Cherry wrote that he had never met a man who cried as easily as Captain Scott. He further wrote that the captain seemed to lack a sense of humor and was a poor judge of character. He would sometimes fall into a depression of irritability, which could take him weeks to crawl out of. But in spite of his flaws, Scott was commended for clamping down his weaknesses, acknowledging his faults, and striving to overcome them. He went against the imperfections which could weigh down a man in his position, and proved himself to be a commanding leader worth listening to, admiring, and following.